Well, I think it's fair to say that I've held my tongue on this topic for more than a minute, and yes, WWDC 2021 threw us all for a loop. I'm sure many of you saw how that ruined my week. And while it would have been so easy to post a negative review and continue to criticize the iPad Pro and that update for what it doesn't provide me with personally, the more I used my iPad Pro and the more I consulted others and used the public beta, I've begun to realize that we as a tech community, including myself, and Apple have got this device all wrong. Before anybody gets ahead of themselves, no, I am not an Apple apologist. I'm not here to make everything better and tell you that the iPad Pro is perfect and that the update is too. Nor am I about to drop a nuclear bomb of negativity on Apple and the iPad Pro just for clout. I think those mentalities are stupid, and that's sort of the basis of this video. I'm gonna talk about YouTuber bias and what we as YouTubers have gotten wrong about this device. I'm gonna talk about Apple fanboys, and I'm gonna rant about why they don't really contribute to innovation and just this device. And then I'm gonna talk about what Apple got wrong and then share some of my final thoughts as to, what I think about iPad Pro now versus then, a couple weeks ago. All right, first up, I want to touch on what I like to call biased YouTuber mentality. And I was definitely prone to this, although I hope I was pretty fair the first week after WWDC, but I was thinking a lot about me and what I wanted, because you have to keep in mind, like every other tech YouTuber, our whole life and work revolves around video production, shooting, editing, and uploading, and many of us Apple tech YouTubers who review iPads use Macs, and more importantly, use Final Cut Pro, and even more importantly, use M1 Macs. And I'm using an M1 MacBook Pro with 16 gigs of RAM. The same specs that are in there are in this, and in my little brain, I thought, you know what? If that's there and this is here, the same Final Cut Pro experience should translate. And even though that's a huge overhaul in terms of interface that Apple would have to do to make it work on here with the touchscreen, blah, 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 it was flawed logic because Apple never promised this. It was just something that we, tech YouTubers sort of expected. And that was not the right thing to do. So with that said, I think it's fair to say that a lot of the negativity or the negative bias surrounding M1 iPad Pro reviews is stemmed in the fact that Apple didn't exactly nod to us video production people in the way that we wanted them to. But of course, we video production people and YouTubers specifically need to know that the world doesn't revolve around us and that our needs are not exclusive. The iPad Pro has a multitude of other uses, from schoolwork to Procreate, sketching and drawing, to AR type tasks, to developing your own apps in Swift Playgrounds. That is the one Pro app from Apple that Apple implemented into the iPad Pro, and good for developers. It's really exciting that you can develop your app on the same device you would run it on. And that's not to say that the people who are disappointed that Final Cut and Logic aren't ported over to the iPad Pro yet aren't valid, but again, I will say this crowd of people, including myself, we're Mac users, and we've been wanting Mac-like features and macOS to sort of slowly make its way onto the iPad Pro, and I don't think that was quite the right mentality this year because Apple's made it very clear that the iPad and the Mac are separate devices. They're going to be separate entities in their ecosystem that work well together, but will never be quite the same thing. YouTubers specifically have been comparing Macs and iPads sort of apples to apples, and I think that's sort of wrong. We forget that these are two distinct devices with two very distinct, albeit somewhat similar experiences with continuity across the board. The last thing I'm gonna say in the section of this video is that I found myself personally not using my iPad Pro enough to really have a valuable opinion on it. So recently I decided to just exclusively use it when I was going on family trips this summer, and my mind has sort of changed, or at least my perspective has sort of changed, because I was so focused on how my iPad wasn't a Mac that I forgot what makes it great as an iPad, if you know what I mean. And maybe some other YouTubers are suffering from that as well. I don't know, but I will say we're very hardware oriented. And once again, we're often comparing iPads and Macs, apples to apples. And truthfully, at this point, I don't think that's the right thing to do anymore. Next up, we're gonna talk about Apple fanboys and their excuses. And I'm here to say, even though I look completely ridiculous right now, defending Apple 100% of the time and thinking that everything they come out with is just incredibly, amazingly great is stupid. And it also stifles innovation. I mean, even though Apple will sell us new features, unless we tell them, what we think and what we dislike, because there are things to dislike about Apple products, they're just gonna give us what they think we want. Like that's the whole basis of product development, user input. So Apple, I think, doesn't expect everybody to love their products for every bit of what they are. You know what I mean? Like, they're very happy with user satisfaction. I think it's fair to say that most Apple users are very satisfied with their devices and with the ecosystem, but there are going to be some products like iPadOS 15 and the iPad Pro that don't make everybody happy. So it's stupid to just pretend like there's no flaws, because it stifles any innovation or any changes that will in the end benefit us users. Also too, constructive criticism is warranted for a product that is this expensive. The iPad Pro is no iPad 8th gen. People pay upwards of $2.5 grand to, use an iPad that they think is going to be super capable, or they thought was going to be super capable before the iPadOS 15 beta or just the operating system itself rolled out. We expected more. So it's stupid to just say, oh, the iPadOS 15 update is just great for all iPads. Not true, considering just how capable the iPad Pro is now with the mini LED display and the 12.9-inch, and with the M1 chip, which we've seen perform so well in its Mac brethren. Another point I want to make is not all criticism is complaining. And believe me, I have complained about what Apple has come out with or what they haven't come out with more so. But I am trying to provide constructive criticism, and other creators are as well. So when I hear people say, oh, well, what is everyone complaining about? It's so annoying. Apple always comes out with great stuff. What are you talking about? Again, that harkens back to my original point. If you believe that Apple does everything right, you are not helping, every user get more of what they want out of the ecosystem, which they pay a lot of money for. I mean, at the end of the day, it is up to the user to determine whether or not an iPad Pro or any Apple device is suited for them. And it's in your best interest to identify what exactly is wrong or what could be better with these products in order to see a better product in the years to come. And also, if I have any amount of integrity as a member of the tech media, it is my duty to provide you with fair and objective coverage derived from many different perspectives. And I've had the pleasure of speaking with 2 different YouTubers about iPad Pro pretty consistently. The first is Isaac, him as Canoopsy. He's a big iPad Pro user. And secondly, and I think more importantly, I've talked to Christopher Lawley, because he is the biggest iPad Pro user on YouTube right now, hands down. He uses iPad Pro for everything, and he is no Apple fanboy by any means. He definitely thinks the iPad Pro and iPadOS 15 could have been better, but he sees more positivity or more capability with iPad Pro because it's the only device that he uses, and he digs into the operating system and has just found so many great things about it. So I have been enlightened by him, which allows me to provide you with, fair, positive-ish coverage. Also too, I'm not going to deprive you of any negative coverage, but at the same time, I'm not going to be overly negative. And even though negative press tends to perform well, my feet are actually falling asleep. I can't, have this iMac in my lap anymore. Even though negative coverage does really well, I'm still not going to sort of fall into the trap of just being negative for the sake of being negative, because I've seen that happen so many times with so many different things, tech, politics, etc. And it's just toxic and annoying, and I don't want to fall into that abyss of just negativity. And because it's useless. I mean, of course, it's good to talk about what's not good, but at the same time, it can't all be bad. And the iPad Pro is an excellent device as it is. However, and this is how I'm going to wrap this portion of this video up, it's not perfect. So, nothing is perfect. iPad Pro and iPadOS are no exception, but at the same time, I'm here to cover them fairly. Last up, I want to talk about what Apple got objectively wrong here, and I'm going to do my best to avoid the YouTuber bias that I talked about earlier in this video. And I guess my overall argument about Apple is that they've been pretty confusing with their product and software launches this year. I will say the M1 hype and marketing did not match the energy of the iPadOS 15 release. It is important to note that the M1 chip is what the A14X would have been, logistically speaking, so it wouldn't make sense for Apple to put any other chip in here, so it was going to inevitably happen. But again, the marketing surrounding the M1 chip just wasn't really addressed. It's like they made a big deal about it. They're like, oh, we put the M1 on the iPad Pro, like, get excited. And then they didn't really have any first-party optimizations or just tweaks or anything that sort of nodded to its existence in the iPad Pro. even though it was going to end up in there, again, it's just confusing, and I don't know why Apple didn't sort of, again, justify why you should buy an M1 in the iPad Pro. And that leads me to my next point, which is they are leaning heavily on third-party developers, third-party applications like LumaFusion, Procreate, apps that will take advantage of the CPU, GPU, and of course the AR camera hardware in the iPad Pro. And that's great and everything. Of course, we do rely on third-party developers to come up with great apps, great actual Pro apps on the iPad, which are exclusive to the iPad and make use of the touchscreen and the Apple Pencil, but still, I mean, I'm not trying to be biased, I'm not trying to say I want any particular apps, but it would have been nice to see just anything that justifies the existence of the M1 in here, because again, the marketing surrounding it was just too good, and of course we saw just how capable these chips are when, running Mac OS and running, apps that are even ported over to the ARM architecture. And speaking of Macs, it seems like Apple's given M1 Macs a lot more love than the M1 iPad Pros, which makes sense because they're trying to, sell more Macs, they're trying to make it known that Apple Silicon is something to be reckoned with. But yeah, they have Rosetta for the Mac, which allows you to run non-native apps in the operating system, and they also ported over Final Cut and Logic, and they also encouraged Adobe to port over Photoshop and Lightroom to, the ARM architecture natively, apps that still aren't quite available on the iPad yet. So it's confusing, of course, when people, learn that the same chip is in here, but you can't do the same things. Again, trying to avoid my, content production bias, but still, it's a good point. Also, too, they put Thunderbolt 4 here, which, as Christopher Lalios pointed out, is great for file transfer. I've even experienced that, even though I do most of my editing on a MacBook Pro. But still, why all that bandwidth if you're not going to accompany it with, external desktop support? That actually makes sense. And of course, that might be coming later on because Apple doesn't, ever show anything that isn't quite ready. And that sort of leads me into my next point, which is the pandemic probably had a huge impact on Apple's development cycle or development process. I mean, the features really point towards COVID related, tasks like video, chatting, they Zoomified, FaceTime, and the screen sharing and all this stuff, making it easier to interact with people virtually. Makes a lot of sense. It also makes sense that they may have focused on quality of life improvements during the pandemic because they were probably easier to develop outside of the office or outside of Apple campus. So perhaps, and this is just an estimation, just a prediction, I'm not promising anything, just like Apple isn't promising anything, maybe these bigger and badder features like a, external desktop display support and Final Cut and Pro apps from Apple and even more is still under development because they could not logistically do it, within their parameters, within their, extreme, this needs to be perfect before we show anybody this type of mentalities. But all the while, we can still criticize them. I'm not going to make excuses for them. They are a $1 trillion company after all. And in my opinion, I would have liked to have seen these quality of life improvements next year. That seems more appropriate, more of an off year compared to this year when they put this chip in iPad Pro, but I digress. So having discussed the community's biases and what Apple got wrong with this device, I now want to share my final thoughts about the M1 iPad Pros with a more clear head and nuanced view. Number one, these devices are made to last. I mean, after all, the A12X and A12Z variants have lasted 2 years and counting. I mean, they're still very viable devices right now, very powerful devices. So the M1 chip in here and the hardware Apple put in here is made to last for years to come. And that's going to be facilitated by third-party optimization and third-party applications like LumaFusion, for example. I mean, although that's an app that suits me personally, so, kind of going off of YouTuber bias, I'm not trying to just talk about just video editing apps, but that app is being optimized to take advantage of the M1 chip and more RAM. We got multicam coming, and I hope that they improve that app even more to sort of rival Final Cut and to maybe encourage other competitors or other video editing app competitors for the iPad Pro platform. I'll also remind you that the 5nm architecture with the M1 chip brings better power efficiency, which translates to better screen on time compared to other iPad Pro models with A12X and Z. So although we're not seeing the operating system or third-party apps taking full advantage of the M1 chip's power yet, at least we get power efficiency, which does make a tangible difference in terms of your ability to use your iPad on the go. Also, as I've said, the mini LED display on the 12.9-inch M1 iPad Pro is fantastic, especially for HDR content, which can take advantage of the crazy amount of brightness or peak brightness you can get from these individually lit zones with this display. The issue is HDR content isn't that widespread, so it's kind of hard to take full advantage of this display. The one aspect of it, though, that is just constant is the 1 million to 1 contrast ratio, even in SDR mode or in the operating system or with anything that you're looking at, HDR or not. It just looks more contrasty, which is a nice addition. Although compared to the 12.9-inch displays from older models, it isn't that much of a difference or not a reason to buy it, but if you love HDR content, by all means buy this, and maybe we'll see HDR become more of a standard in the future. So this is future-proof, but still, it's hard to take full advantage of this really advanced display in here, no matter how great it actually is on paper. As for the software in question, if you look and use the iPadOS 15 beta in a sort of vacuum, you will find that it is actually a very nice update with very many quality of life improvements. I love the multitasking interface, I love the shelf, I love the app library, and a lot of other features that Apple has brought. FaceTime links, I made a whole video about that and how iPadOS 15 features will benefit students, and I'm very excited to use this in the fall. However, I think it is very fair to say that the iPadOS 15 update lacks any first-party optimizations or clear uses of the incredible hardware in here, which gives you less of a reason to buy this iPad as of right now. So, I suggest that you wait for third-party, applications to better take advantage of the hardware in here, and also consider buying a used or an unopened last-gen iPad, because those iPads are still very, very powerful compared to everything else. I mean, the A12X and Z are fantastic processors, and if I wasn't a tech YouTuber, I still would be using my 2020 model, probably my 2018 model very happily for my own usage case, like note-taking and Notion and YouTube and whatever I'm doing with it right now, which isn't too intensive. And that brings us to one of our final points here. It is a quote from Marques Brownlee himself. I'm sure you've heard this many times, but I'm going to iterate it here. And he said, "Never buy hardware with the promise of software." And in this case specifically, I would say never buy hardware from Apple with the promise, let alone expectation of software, because they didn't promise us anything, but we just sort of saw patterns. We're like, oh, well, the M1's in here, we should expect A, B, and C, and that is the wrong way to think. Also, that leads into another point. macOS is never going to be iPadOS, and iPadOS is never going to be macOS. I kind of mixed that up, but you get what I mean. They made that very clear a couple years ago, and I think they want to keep the experiences very different, which is good and bad. So we have to be aware of our biases. iPad users or iPadOS users have to realize that iPadOS isn't perfect, and macOS users need to realize that iPadOS will never be macOS, because again, they are two distinct operating systems. And Apple, I guess, will have to decide which one is more viable for the future. So hopefully we see, iPadOS features that sort of mimic the Mac, but of course they will never be like the Mac. I mean, like Craig Federighi said when Marques asked him, is there going to be a calculator app? They haven't figured out how to make it great yet. So I anticipate that there's a lot more in the pipeline for iPad Pro or iPadOS. So we're just going to have to see. And again, like I said, COVID probably had a lot to do with it. But regardless of what iPadOS has or doesn't have, or what the iPad Pro can do or can't do, I think I'm going to shift my perspective a bit for now and focus on what it can do, have that glass half full mentality, because it's kind of annoying to just focus on hardware and once again compare devices apples to apples, Mac to iPad, iPad to Mac. It's not very fruitful, and it's a lot more fun to discover new ways to use iPad Pro. So I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna try to shift my content a bit here, because after all, even though iPad Pro is not a perfect platform, it is very versatile, exciting, and fun. It is a distinct experience that I want to share with you more and how I use it. So, and that about wraps up this video here. Like I said, I'm trying to have a better, more positive mentality, a more demo driven, let's see what tech can do, because that's really exciting, while at the same time, having a sort of realistic outlook and holding Apple accountable for what they should be doing with iPad Pro and what the community wants. So I'm glad I waited. I'm glad that I sort of let this stew in my head and mature. I would really appreciate it if you leave a like, comment, and of course subscribe for more content like this. Expect more from me coming soon. And as always, I'm Noah, and I will catch you all in the next one.